I'm going to present some information today on cannabis potency, an area that I've been doing research on for well over a decade, because you'll see why in a minute. It takes a long time to do this sort of stuff. And this is including some analysis of some cannabis seizures that we finally got to analyse in New South Wales. So I hope you enjoy it. Just give you some context, some background context to this study. Many moons ago, in 1999, the director of NDARC, Wayne Hall, and myself wrote a paper in response to claims back then that cannabis in Australia, even back then, was markedly increased in potency. It was this horrible drug, that it was different to what it used to be, and that it was causing all sorts of problems. And we wrote a paper basically saying that there was very little evidence worldwide to claim huge increases. Some American longitudinal data had shown some increases from a very low baseline, but there wasn't really much around in terms of evidence. And certainly in Australia, we've never tested for it. And we argued that perhaps it was more likely that people were using more potent parts of the plant, that is the heads, and using it from a younger age and more frequently, that may have been the issue. Rolling along, we get 2004, when the debate continues, and the US drug czar of the time argued that cannabis was a much stronger drug. It was a different drug today, and he claimed that this is not the drug you joked about in the 60s. Continuing on in 2006, and then Premier of New South Wales, Morris Yema, imposed tough penalties for hydroponic cannabis cultivation. And he argued that hydroponic cannabis can be up to 5 to 7 times stronger in its levels of THC, which is the active psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. And it makes it more attractive to some cannabis users. He says it has worrying consequences for anyone who is a regular user of this form of cannabis. So back in 2006, policy decisions were being made according to the proposed characteristics of cannabis in terms of potency. In 2007, there had been a big campaign in the UK where cannabis had been downgraded in terms of severity, and the independent newspaper had a big hand in pushing for that. And then in 2007, they did a turnaround and reschedule cannabis as a harder drug. And in an unprecedented move, the Independent apologised on its front page over a decriminalisation campaign. And again, the main push behind the reclassification was cannabis potency, saying it was stronger, and again, it was more dangerous. 2011 in the Netherlands, the Gerritsen Commission recommended cannabis containing at least 15% THC be banned from the coffee shops that are frequent in the Netherlands. It's not clear what they based that 15% level on, but it was, and I don't even know if they've actually implemented that recommendation. It's very hard to find anything on it. But that was a level at which cannabis was presumed, if you like, to be a hard drug, in inverted commas, and was going to be the subject of greater penalties. Again, a potency-based policy. And finally, of course, we're working in an era now where cannabis has been legalised in Colorado and Washington State in the US, despite it being illegal at a federal level. And in the Uruguay, of course, it has been made legal in the country as a whole, and there are increasing pushes for cannabis reform elsewhere. So we're in an environment where there are pushes for changes in legislation and enduring arguments about cannabis potency. So in a nutshell, what is the issue? There are 3 main points I want to discuss, and the first is cannabis stronger than it used to be? Is there evidence for a potency increase? Now, traditionally, people had assessed potency as the percentage of THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the ingredient, the cannabinoid that makes you stoned. But it's not as simple as that. Cannabis is a complicated drug. It contains a large number of chemicals, or cannabinoids, including CBD, or cannabidiol. And that has increasingly become part of the argument, increasingly important. And the issue becomes now, is the fact that there are just high levels of THC per se and small levels of CBD, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute, but it's the profile of cannabis that's becoming important. The second issue is, do current cultivation methods promote high-potency cannabis? Now, we know there's been a big increase over the last decade or two in the indoor growing market, that there's been a big move from outdoor growing to indoor, where it's easier to avoid police detection. And the argument becomes, do indoor growing methods produce cannabis of a greater potency or a different cannabinoid profile than those of outdoor methods, and is it more dangerous? And thirdly, does this cause harms? Does it cause harms to mental health? Does it cause harms to your cognition or memory? And is it more likely to cause cannabis use disorder? So what is the evidence of these varying arguments? So firstly, let's turn to cannabis. Is it stronger? There have been a number of longitudinal studies of seizures in the US, UK, Europe and New Zealand. We've never had a legal imperative in Australia to test, so we've never ever had Australian data apart from the odd study here and there. But the long-term US studies have shown definite increases in cannabis, albeit from a low baseline. So, for example, herbal cannabis on average in the US has increased from, say, 3% THC in 1993, and in 2008 it had more than doubled to 8.8%, while CBD levels had remained low at about 0.3%. There have been similar increases in the UK. The Netherlands has been a bit of a special case that I'll discuss in a minute. There were also small increases in the 90s in New Zealand, although they haven't had so much of a testing program since. Similar evidence from a variety of different studies in Europe. Definitely there has been a trend, a THC increase over the past decade to around, depending on the type of cannabis, around 10 to 12%. A lot of the studies have used different methodologies. The cannabis has come from different sources. They haven't necessarily outlined whether it's herbal cannabis, for instance, the heads or the leaves, what part of the cannabis, or whether it's sinsemilla, which pops up now quite a lot, which is the unfertilized female plant and is often used as the word to describe very high potency cannabis. Cannabis sinsemilla tends to have much higher potency, however, when it's reported as up to about 15% in the UK. And in the Netherlands, they grow something called Nederwiet, which is a very high potency indoor variety, and that's been the stuff that's been sold at Dutch coffee shops. So there has been certainly instances of an increase and some high potency cannabis, but there is also tremendous variability within the year, within any one year, within any one country, and even within any one plant. If you take the heads of a cannabis plant, you will find tremendous variations in potency, even amongst one single plant. There has been signs of stabilisation in some countries, for instance the UK and perhaps possibly the US. It's a bit hard to get your hands on the US data. So yes, cannabis is stronger. The pattern does seem to be, from a variety of small and long-scale studies, of high THC, low CBD levels. That does seem to have become the trend. However, there are important other factors in terms of the amount of cannabis you're exposed to, or THC, and that is the part of the plant you smoke. Is it the heads, the leaf? Certainly in Australia, leaf does have little market value, and you typically don't get much of that anymore. And the type of cannabis, so is it resin, is it hash, etc., etc. The next question is it associated with cultivation methods? Australian surveys, certainly I did one a little while ago with the general population who did believe that indoor cannabis was stronger, but the rationale for this would be that if you've got greater control over your growing environment, you produce greater consistency in the cannabis, and you're more likely to bring a cannabis to its full genetic potential. And genetics is certainly the biggest factor in cannabis potency. So with selective breeding, you can grow high THC strains for consumption, and certainly the market seems to think that high THC strains is what's preferred. And you can compare this, for instance, to medicinal cannabis, where this is grown for therapeutic value, so you may have much higher levels of CBD involved because that's perceived to have high therapeutic potential, and people aren't taking that cannabis to get high at all. So you've got, for instance, GW Pharmaceuticals in the UK making pharmaceutical cannabinoids such as Sativex, where the THC and CBD levels are equal. Some of the UK, Dutch and New Zealand studies have certainly, where they've said what sort of cannabis they've analysed, have certainly suggested that those varieties linked to intensive indoor cultivation, for instance, the sinsemilla, do sometimes reported to have high THC and lower CBD levels, but not always. And that's important because it is indoor cultivated cannabis that dominates seizures internationally. However, we don't know how well growers actually cultivate cannabis, and certainly in field work I've done in the past with growers, there is a lot of concern that the big-scale growers aren't interested in quality, they're interested in yield. So they don't necessarily know how to grow particularly well. They may be following manuals from the internet, so they're often after yield, and they can actually produce quite low-potency cannabis depending on when it's picked in terms of maturation of the potency level. However, there is certainly evidence that does link indoor cultivation to high THC cannabis, and that's potentially because of the strains that are grown indoors. Is it associated with increased harm? Now, this is still poorly understood. Now, cannabidiol is thought to offset some of the impairing effects of THC. So two of the main impairing effects THC can have is obviously on the memory, on your short-term memory, and on producing psychotic or psychosis-like effects in people, anxiety and delusional thinking, etc. CBD is thought to offset some of these impairing effects of THC. Certainly some animal research suggests that, but there is also animal research to suggest that it can actually make or exacerbate some of these effects. So it's still not clear. There are some human laboratory findings showing that if you give people THC, it has a dose-dependent effect, so the more you give them directly, it can induce psychotic symptoms in people. And there are studies, a lot coming from the University College of London in the UK, which are showing that first episode psychosis patients prefer high-potency preparations, that it can bring forward an initial onset of psychosis in conjunction with daily use, and that perhaps high THC, low CBD is linked to psychosis in some way. Again, the findings are not universal, but they are certainly showing some biological plausibility. Again, there are also some studies showing that CBD, if you give rats or humans CBD, it can protect against the cognitive impairment of THC. In terms of increased use or risk of dependence, does high THC level mean that people are more likely to use cannabis or be dependent? We don't know. There is no directly relevant research. Peggy van der Pol in the Netherlands, though, has done a recent study that shows that users of more potent cannabis do titrate their dose, and there is a little bit of research on this, that perhaps if you use more, people titrate their dose anyway, such that they don't get as much exposure to the cannabis. They tend to smoke less. It's not a universal finding in studies. Some people just like to get as stoned as they can. However, she also found that the strongest predictor of dependence in her study was not potency, it was smoking behaviour. So how many puffs they made, all that sort of stuff, smoking topography it's called. So there is certainly some evidence that THC, high THC, is associated with harm, and that potentially CBD does offset this. So if cannabis that is currently being used has the characteristics of high THC, low CBD, there is biological reason that it could possibly cause harm. Now, these concerns are relevant to Australia because we do have one of the highest cannabis rates in the world. We continue to do so. At 2012-13 board... Oh, what's happened here? How did that happen? Let me just go back. Sorry about that, guys. And these concerns are relevant because we have one of the highest rates of cannabis use in the world, and the 2012-13 border detections are in Australia the highest on record, and 89% of these are seeds, predominantly arriving through the post, purchased predominantly on the internet for home cultivation. We have widespread intensive domestic cultivation internationally. We have the highest seizures in a decade in Australia, and in 2010-11 in New South Wales, more than 20,000 seizures were made from indoor grow operations, some of these very big. We have no legal imperative to test for potency, so we've never had any local data apart from the odd study, as I said. And in 2009, the Australian National Council on Drugs did recommend that potency data be regularly collected and collated across Australia, but nothing has ever come to bear from this. We'd originally intended to do this study in the early 2000s in Western Australia, and unfortunately it fell through at the last minute, and we were then approached by New South Wales Police, who kindly agreed to provide us with cannabis seizures. And so I'd like to acknowledge those people at New South Wales Police that you can see listed there, particularly Detective Superintendent Nick Bingham, who went above and beyond the call of duty. Now, this study was done with collaborators from the University of Sydney, including Ian McGregor, who I think you'll hear from next week, Alex Wong, John Arnold and Kong Lee, who did the analyses of the cannabis, funded through NCPIC, through the Australian Government Department of Health and Ageing. Thank you, Jan, for sticking with us for so long when this looked like it was going pear-shaped and took a long time. It takes a lot of time and patience to do this research, despite it just involving cannabis. There are lots of legal loopholes to go through. The aims of the study were to provide the first, basically Australian data on the cannabinoid profile of street-level cannabis seizures obtained under the New South Wales Cannabis Cautioning Scheme, which you may or may not be familiar with. So adults in New South Wales, if they're in possession of no more than 15 grams of cannabis or equipment for use, they can receive a police caution rather than face criminal charges and court proceedings. So they're diverted from the criminal justice system. So that cannabis is not required for evidence, and it is usually just taken away and destroyed very rapidly. So we were given access to this cannabis. Obviously, we don't know where it comes from because it's not as identified with a source. but it allows us to look at what people on the streets are caught with and therefore smoking. So we obtained 200 cautioning seizures that had been seized between October 2010 and October 2011. 40% from rural regional commands, including the New South Wales North Coast, which is one of the epicentres of cannabis growing in culture in Australia, and the other 60% through urban metropolitan seizures. So a whole 23 police commands in New South Wales. We only analysed seizures containing green plant material, so if they were mixed with tobacco, we rejected them because they can impede the analysis. So most of the seizures contained one piece of green plant material, and a couple contained a couple of more, but we had a total of 206 samples for analysis. The second aim, because we were interested in knowing, well, is cannabis potency higher amongst indoor or outdoor grown cannabis, we got separate permission to obtain samples from New South Wales Police crop eradication programs that were going on in New South Wales. So these were from a variety of strike force operations in Sydney and the North Coast, the mid-North Coast, that allowed us to examine potential differences in cannabis profiles between outdoor and indoor grown. So of the known provenance samples, we only had a small number of those. So 13 were from a cannabis eradication program in the mid-North Coast and 13 from Sydney. And a sample of soil was also collected during all the growing medium. They were all indoor grown, but all the indoor grown were actually grown in soil indoors, not hydroponic mediums. And they were collected from each site and delivered to the lab. Now, all samples were stored and analysed in a secure laboratory in the Department of Pharmacology at Sydney Uni. And I'm sure you're not necessarily particularly interested in the methods we used to extract cannabis, but it was according to standard protocols, using standards from GW Pharmaceuticals in the UK. We had to follow strict procedures where we logged, photographed and weighed the samples. We analysed them in triplicate, not duplicate, and took the average of two of the results, and there wasn't much variation. We checked the methods with experts in the field, and there's a publication from this analysis which I'll put up at the end. The cannabinoids we analysed obviously were THC as the main ingredient. Is very important to analyse. Now, THC and THC-A. THC is the main psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, but when it's in raw form, that is the plant, and not heated, it's in the form of acid. It's called acidonic THC. This is not psychoactive. When it's heated or over time as it degrades, it becomes psychoactive. So that's why in the United States there's a huge industry in the medicinal area of juicing raw plant material to get the cannabinoids, because in that form THC is not psychoactive. So we analysed both the THC and the THC-A, because if the plant's fresh, most of the THC will be in the acidonic form. We also looked at CBD. As we said, it's thought to antagonise THC effects, and this exists mostly in plants as a precursor to in acidonic form. Again, there were some other things we looked at. These four. CBN's important because this is a product that occurs when cannabis breaks down, THC breaks down. So theoretically, if you've got low levels of CBN, that means you've got fresh cannabis. These other THCV, CBC and CBG used to be much higher in the plant decades ago, and they do have some therapeutic benefit potentially. So the results from the cautioning samples are as follows. The first thing to note is we found a very consistent pattern with the overseas results. So high THC, low CBD. So you can see here that there was a wide range of THC. The THC total figure you see there is actually a figure that you get from adjusting for the different molecular weights of the THC-A and THC. So it's sort of like a combined measure adjusting for the different weights. So that's an average of 15% THC, median 14%, roughly the same. And you can see when we compare it to data from the US and the UK, it's on the same level as the strong Sinsemilla cannabis that was analysed there. So we were finding very high levels of cannabis with THC, high THC. If you look at CBD, you can see very low levels, low range generally. The mean was 0.1, median 0.04, and again, very much on a par with those found in overseas cannabis. CBN, was very low, indicating that the samples were fresh. Now, 3/4 of the samples contained at least THC, 10% THC, and almost a half contained at least 15% THC. And bear in mind that 15% was set as the level for cannabis to be classified as a hard drug under the Garrison Commission, although, as I said, we don't know what basis they used that 15% figure from. Now, this, of course, isn't necessarily a new issue. Now, these are data from Laurie Mather, who's always been a big champion of sensible research into medicinal cannabis in Australia. And he published in the first Australian Journal of Pharmaceutical Sciences, which was a short-lived journal, in 1972. And you can see there he's already got a wild soil-grown sample with a THC level of 11%. There have always been samples of high-potency cannabis. The issue is, of course, is this the norm rather than the exception these days? Is this the pattern? You can see the distribution of cannabinoids here. It's positively skewed to there's a lot of samples with higher levels. And the other cannabinoids there, 91% of the samples contain less than 0.1% of CBD. And CBG was more widely scattered, and that's one that used to be quite dominant in cannabis in earlier years. Comparison of rural and urban seizures, just for interest, we found that rural seizures had significantly higher levels of most of the cannabinoids, including THC and CBD. Now, you may speculate that if they're rural, they would be outdoor grown, but unfortunately we don't know. It's an interesting possibility. So we move on now to the results of the known provenance sample, so the indoor versus the outdoor seizures. And we find the same pattern as with the cannabis cautioning samples. High THC, low CBD again. So an average of 19% in indoor and 16% or 15% in the outdoor grown cannabis. So that's high. Again, very low levels of CBD, around 0.1%, 0.03 in the outdoor. And again, low levels of CBN, indicating the freshness of the samples. There was not much evidence for differences, however, between the outdoor and indoor samples, potentially because we had low power to detect differences. The sample just wasn't big enough. There was a trend, as you can see, to have higher potency in the indoor samples, but not much difference in terms of CBD or CBG between the others. Now I've got to work out how to shut that. That's better. Again, you can see not much difference between indoor and outdoor, depending on the cannabinoids analysed. So in terms of a summary of the data, we find that the Australian data did certainly confirm international trends. We have a dominance of THC in Australian, or at least New South Wales cannabis, compared to CBD content. The levels are similar to those in overseas studies which have cited Sinsemilla, which is a highly potent indoor-grown variety. And these data certainly do provide baseline data and a methodology to monitor seizures in Australia, although there's nothing forthcoming, unfortunately, in terms of funding to do things like this. We would like to repeat these data elsewhere, and I know certainly in North Queensland there's been a project there where they're trying to get this done, but it is an extremely difficult thing to do as a one-off study because of the difficulties in accessing seizures and analysing the seizures in terms of getting funding and all the legislation you have to go through. We found little difference between urban and rural seizures. We can't, as I said, say that much because we don't know if they were indoor or outdoor grown. But when we did analyse a particular sample, we found very similar profiles between the two. Potentially a trend toward more THC in indoor grown, but we can't confirm that at all, unfortunately. In terms of what the implications are for this, well, does it matter? Well, yes, it does if it translates to greater harm. If this is the cannabis that people by and large around the world are smoking these days with high THC, it does matter if they're more likely to have harms. The problem is there's very, very little analysis actually that looks at whether this profile of cannabis relates to any harms. No one's really looked at it. There's certainly a biological plausibility from what we know in terms of the way THC and CBD operate in terms of the brain. There's some animal studies and some laboratory studies that indicate that for mental health there may be some outcomes that we need to monitor, particularly in terms of psychosis, memory loss. and also particularly for young people who have developing brains. We know already that cannabis has a large impact on the developing brain. There's some good work done by Dan Lubman looking at MRIs of cannabis's impact. We also know already that the earlier you use and the more frequently you use, the more likely you are to get into cannabis, trouble with cannabis as you go through the life course. So if you're smoking more potent cannabis, there are potential issues there in terms of the harms experienced. We also don't know, however, what the effective potency of cannabis is if you do get exposed to more. That is, you may be smoking more potent cannabis, but how much of it actually reaches your brain, and that has a lot to do with the smoking technique, how much side stream smoke and therefore THC do you lose, how successfully do people titrate their dose and so forth. So we don't know as much about how high THC translates into behaviour, or how much gets into the blood and what impact it has on people who smoke. So we certainly need more research examining the impact of different cannabinoid contents on the health of users, with bearing in mind vulnerable groups such as those with mental health issues and young people. I probably will finish there and maybe leave a couple of minutes for questions. I've just put up some publications. The top publication is the paper we had recently published last year. It's an open access journal, PLOS ONE, so you can just go in there and download that paper if you're interested. And the others are two earlier papers we published on cannabis potency since 2000. So thank you very much for your time.